So we've already started using Photoshop some, but I haven't really explained why at all. When it comes to the internet, there aren't really any programs that are considered standard. There are internet standards in the way that you do things and the way that we code things, but as far as what programs to use, there aren't really any standards. There are tons of options out there, which code editors to use, visual editors, there's just a variety of things, and we'll use a few throughout this course. However, when it comes to graphics, there is a standard, and that standard is Photoshop. Does everybody use Photoshop? No, but the vast majority do. And if you're interested in being a web designer, you should know it. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about in this is Photoshop. So I'll go over some of those basics, some of the ideas of why Photoshop, what is Photoshop, because we haven't even really talked about that yet, and then what if you can't get Photoshop? What if Photoshop is too expensive? So we'll cover a few of those, and we'll try to keep it pretty short. So the first one is, what is Photoshop? So Photoshop is by Adobe. It is a professional level software, and it's used by many. And so throughout this class, we'll talk about different things, different pieces of software. You'll use different pieces of software. And when it comes to the software we use, you probably haven't heard of a lot of them yet. You probably haven't heard of Brackets. You probably haven't heard of Dreamweaver. You probably haven't heard of Fireworks. So there's different softwares that we'll talk about that you probably aren't familiar with. But you've probably heard of Photoshop. Pretty much everybody has heard of Photoshop. So it's used by tons of people. And part of that is because it is an industry standard. Pretty much every industry that does stuff with computers pretty much uses Photoshop. So it's a great piece of software, whether it be for graphic editing, whether it be for creating new graphics, whether it be for editing photographs. You can even do 3D rendering in Photoshop, and you can even edit video in Photoshop now. So there's a lot of things that it can do. It's been around for quite a while. So it's used by tons of people in the industry and in lots of different industries. So it's extremely widely used, extremely well known, and it's become part of our common culture, part of our language and everything. So people talk about things being photoshopped. The photo's not perfect, but we'll fix it later. We'll Photoshop it, or this photo doesn't look real. It was probably photoshopped. So there's different things like that. It's just widely known. It's a widely used term now. Pretty much everyone knows what it is, even if they don't have a clue how to use it or how it is used. So here's Photoshop.com, and this is sort of a website about Photoshop by Adobe, but they also have their product page. So if I go back to Google, I go to the other link, adobe.com/products/photoshop.html. We can see this isn't loading right. Maybe let's try a more updated browser, maybe Firefox, since my version of Safari isn't even close to up to date. As we start doing more complex things and making more complex sites, we will update our browsers and make sure that they are all up to date, so you can see that that what you're building is loading the way it should on current browsers. But even then, it's not a bad idea to have some that are out of date or to have access to machines with outdated browsers, because not everybody updates their browsers. A lot of companies and organizations don't. As you can see, a lot of my browsers aren't up to date because the organization, the district, doesn't update them. We have to update them ourselves. So here is Adobe.com's Photoshop page. They've got different information. There's a little video here that we could play. Information about the software, different things, new updates, etc., etc., etc. So I guess the next thing is, when it comes to Photoshop, I guess it's sort of important to mention the price point. So a little while ago, Photoshop moved to, and all of Adobe moved to, a subscription plan. And a professional can pay $50 a month to have access to all of their software, which is a huge amount of software. Well, it's not all of their software, but it's almost all of their software. It's a ton of software. So if we go to Creative Cloud, you can click down there as well, they get access to They get access to lots. They get access to mobile apps, so we can look at all the mobile apps. They get access to desktop apps, and these are cross-platform. So there's just a ton of different apps for a variety of things: video editing, sound editing, magazine layouts, book layouts, web design, vector art. So just a variety of things that you can do with their products. Now, that being said, it is kind of expensive. $50 a month is quite a bit of money, but if it's what you do, if it's what you use every day for your job, then, you know, it might be worth it. Here are some of their mobile apps that they have. Some of these are new. I'll have to try some of these out, because some of these I haven't seen before. Voice is pretty cool. I actually got to try Voice out over the summer at Adobe before it had been released. And I even tried out their alpha build of it, or probably more of a beta build of it, the previous summer when it was actually going by a different name. But I don't know how much of that I can talk about because I did have to sign an NDA. But it was cool. It was cool to see it progress and develop, and now it finally be released. So these are sort of their programs. So, you know, $50 a month, that's quite a bit. If you just want one, like you just want one piece of software, you can pay $20 a month instead, but that's still a lot. I mean, you look at, for a year, that's $240 for the year, whereas this is $600 for the year. They do have a special photography plan, which gives you Photoshop and Lightroom, which is a very cool piece of software. It's basically Photoshop, but it's slimmed down and made really sleek and optimized for photographers. So it can't do everything that Photoshop can, but if you're doing photography, it's super efficient for that. I really enjoy using Lightroom for my photography work. But that's for, you know, if you're a regular individual. Students and teachers, you can get a cheaper deal. You have a special offer right now of $19.99, but later on it moves up to $20.99 when you're no longer a new customer. So this is promotional pricing for the first year. So then it later moves up to $29.99, so $30 a month. So, you know, you're looking at almost $400 a year, and that is pretty pricey. But it just depends, you know, if this is what you're doing, if this is something that you're really focused on, and you're going to spend a lot of time on, and you might make this a career, then, you know, it's hard to not do it. But it is a lot of money. Not everybody likes the subscription plan, and so you do have a fair amount of people who rebelled against that when Adobe went that direction, and they bought the old version, CS6, which we're still using at school because that was the last time that we upgraded. We normally skip a version, so we went from CS4 to CS6. You can buy that still, but it's sort of out of print now. So the old version has gotten pretty expensive as the people who don't like subscriptions have really increased the price. When it was originally released, I think it was like $600, so it's gone up by quite a bit. But it is what it is. So that aside, we'll talk about what some of the options are for people who can't afford Photoshop. So why Photoshop? So I already mentioned it's the industry standard. It's what tons of people use in a variety of industries. When I met with EA this past summer, they said that, you know, Photoshop is pretty much a must for their designers and developers. And that was meeting with a senior engineer of EA. When I met with EA the previous year with their marketing director, one of their marketing directors for one of their extremely well-known games, he said pretty much everyone in EA, like, you should pretty much know Photoshop. And it's not just EA. Pretty much every company that does anything digital, anything technology related, Photoshop's a good skill to have. It's a very powerful tool. There's tons of things you can do with it, as I mentioned earlier. So 3D, video, of course, graphics. You can do photo editing. So there's just a ton of things you can do with it. It didn't become so well known without a reason. When it comes to web design, it's probably most important because it's pixel based. and you can edit it down to the individual pixels, so you can make sure that the graphics that you're creating, the graphics you want your users to see, look exactly the way that you intend them to, because you can edit the individual pixels. And you can do a lot with them, and it's not the only one, but it's probably the most powerful one and the most widely used one. And as such, probably the easiest one to get help on when you're stuck too, because there's so many people that know how to use it, and so much free information out there on how to use it and how to do things with it, because it's so widely used. So it is the industry standard even for web design when it comes to graphics. It's also pretty much the industry standard for creating mock-ups. So, you have a client who wants a website. You typically don't build the website from scratch, using all code and everything to show them to see if you have the same idea. You would typically create a quick graphical representation of it in Photoshop and show them that, to make sure that you're on the same page, to make sure that you're understanding what they want. It's a lot easier that way. You don't want to waste all this time trying to get the code to be perfect and then them to say they don't like it, because you could have done all that a lot faster in Photoshop. And of course you have to convert it to code later to get it to run right and do what it's supposed to, but for the aesthetics of it, you use Photoshop typically. And so what are your options? So if you can't pay for Photoshop, if that's too much money for you, you're not the only one. A lot of people do use it. I use Photoshop almost every day, and so for me it's worth it. But if it's not for you, if it's not worth it for you, or you just can't afford it, there are other options. And if you go to Google and you actually type alternatives, you can actually already see down here alternatives to Photoshop. And as I get further, I mean it's widely searched, and you can find full lists of alternatives to Photoshop. Are they as good? I don't think so, but if you can't afford it, it's better than having nothing. The most common one, the most common alternative, and the one that most people recommend is GIMP. And so this is most commonly used as the alternative to Photoshop. Now, a lot of these alternatives, they can't do everything that Photoshop can. When you search them up, some of them will be just photo editors, and it's an alternative for editing photos to Photoshop. Some of them are just vector editors, so it's an alternative to Photoshop for vector, although you really shouldn't use Photoshop for vector anyways. You should use Adobe Illustrator for that, but whatever, that aside. So even though you find some alternatives, keep in mind that it's often just a certain area. But it's better than nothing. If you can't afford Photoshop, there are alternatives that you can use without having to break the law, without having to pirate. So that's it for this video. We'll keep using Photoshop. You'll keep learning little bits here and there. And yeah.